system's rigged, man, it's time to break free. Eyes wide open, gotta see what I see. Standing on the front lines, fighting for the truth. Lift the veil of lies, it's time to be the proof. Take a stand, don't you back down. Raise your voice, let's shake the town. We're the voices that won't be ignored. Breaking chains, yeah, we're ready for war. With the power of the people, we'll make them see a world of justice, united and free. United and free.
Gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The show starts in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
All right, everybody, justice is a process here, and we have ourselves another trial. This trial has been going on this week. Now, we were knee-deep in some other trials, so I was planning to cover this one as a non-live trial, but we have an opportunity to get caught up because it's still going on. So today we're going to be covering, well, we're going to be trying to get as caught up as we can, but we're going to start off with days 1 and 2. The trial started, I believe, on Tuesday, either Monday or Tuesday. And it started out with, they got done with jury selection and then they went right into closing arguments. Now this, or opening statements. Now this is not a trial that's being covered on any of the major networks here. So this is one that's being covered by a local Florida news station. It's the same prosecution attorney's office that did the Sarah Boone case. It's in the same courtroom. You're going to see that. And basically the background here is there was a police chase that ended up going to a police station. Officers were called for backup. This officer arrives and then doesn't follow protocol and deploys his taser at a gas station, sets it on fire, and kills a man. So he is on fire. He is on trial for culpable. It's called first degree culpable negligent homicide. So he's facing, I think it's like 20 years in prison, but he's got several other charges. He's got like assault, aggravated assault, stuff like that comes out of his negligence. So he's on trial for his life. Right now, the live trial is still in the defense case. I think they're going to probably end up going to closing arguments today, and the jury will start deliberating. I have a feeling this case is going to be one that's going to probably deliberate for a little while. So I think this weekend we're going to have a good shot of getting up to speed. Looking back at I believe we've had this is like day 4 of the trial. So we have, or maybe this is day 5 of the trial. It's day 4 or 5. Like I said, the first day was just opening statements. It happened at the end of the court day, and then it goes into testimony the next day. And I think the prosecution only put on a day and a half case. So I think we're on day 5. So this must have been it was the end of Monday when this case began. So that's where we're at. So we're going to start with, like I said, opening statements. We're going to move then into day 2, and we'll see how long that takes to get through it. The broadcasts themselves are telling me it's like 10 hours, but I was looking through, there's long breaks. I think we really only have maybe 5-6 hours of court. So I have, up to 10 hours of streaming. So if we can, we may move into day 3, or I may end the stream and restart a new day 3 stream, depending on where we're at in the day. Like I said, my goal is to try to broadcast this throughout the weekend, so that we can get caught up on this trial. And I don't think there'll be a verdict. You never know. Like I said, this is it's not the same judge as Sarah Boone, but it's the same courthouse. And as we know, that case, they were having that jury go into the night. So they might do the same thing here. But juries tend to take a while on police officer cases. It tends to be more extended deliberations. So I could see them either deliberating into the weekend, or the judge, if it went to closing arguments today. Because right now the defense is presenting its case. And this officer testified yesterday. So like I said, we have a lot to catch up on. It's a very interesting case. It's one of these cases where, is it bad judgment? Should this police officer be held accountable? He made a split-second decision. He blew up a gas station when he did it. And that's what we're gonna be answering as jurors, as we hear the case, hear the law, and hear this broken down. So with that said, buckle in. We're going into opening statements. I'm going to go ahead and cue it up. And, that's where we're going to head. So give me a moment and let me make sure everything's good to go with these. I believe it is. And let's jump into the courtroom. All right, so here we are, guys. Like I said, opening statements. We're going to begin them, and we will move directly into testimony as soon as this is over. Even though the day of trial ended here, we're going to move right into day 2 as soon as this happens and start listening to the witness testimony. So let's go ahead and get started.
Now, the defendant you are going to hear was trained in various areas. The use of force. He was trained on what level of force is appropriate to use and acceptable to use under the rules when detaining someone, such as this victim. And one of that usage of force is tasers, the deployment of tasers. And he was actually issued shortly before this incident a taser by his agency. And so one of the requirements, as you will hear and as you will see in documentation, is that the defendant was trained on specific usage of tasers, but also the extremely high risk. In fact, deputies are trained to not deploy tasers around a gasoline pump, as it can cause, and did in this case, ignite a gigantic fire, resulting in the injuries to Mr. Barretto that day. You will also hear from an expert witness, Brian Childs. He works for Axon. That is the company who issues tasers, body camera video cameras to law enforcement agencies, other forms of technology that law enforcement agencies often use. But one of those main ones in this case is the taser. And his job is to download and analyze data that can be pulled off of tasers, such as the one that was utilized by the defendant in this case. That data you will be able to see yourself, down to the second, what was happening on that taser. From when the safety was turned off or turned back on and turned off again, to when the trigger was pulled and for how long the discharge occurred. And he's going to interpret and explain to you his opinion of that data in connection with body camera video. So his job is to essentially analyze anything that is available and put together, in this case, a very detailed timeline of the events that occurred and that you will see yourself. He's going to testify that tasers do not go off accidentally. This was not an accident. He will testify about the amount of force that it takes to pull a trigger, to turn a safety off, and that the defendant willfully pulled the trigger that day to issue the taser again, in a pool of gasoline and around and next to vehicles that were pumping gas and leaking gasoline virtually everywhere in that space. He's going to testify that there's no scenario or no facts that support that this was a short-circuited taser or that it went off or malfunctioned. He himself tested the taser after the fact and it was fully functioning. Now, throughout the course of this case, the defense may focus on Mr. Barretto's flight earlier that day from police and the concern that he may have had a gun. Now, the state urges you to pay close attention to any evidence that is presented. And if you do hear assertions made that the defendant was worried or concerned that Mr. Barretto possessed a firearm, we submit that those assumptions, which were unfounded, were based on careless police work itself. After the victim was searched, and you will be able to see his body, him sitting on the ground after he is extinguished through the use of a fire extinguisher on the side of the parking lot, he was not in the possession of any weapon at all. There was no gun. But in the end, ladies and gentlemen, nothing will change the actions that the defendant took that day, the deliberate steps that he took, and the reckless disregard for the safety of everyone around in that area. There are policies, there are laws that apply to the deployment of tasers, but there's also very real risks, one of which actually happened that day, which is the risk of ignition and a fire explosion of that gas pump. And that is a result of the defendant's own action. There were no alternative means of restraining this individual that were taken besides what other deputies felt were sufficient when they showed up to the scene, which was that 2 deputies, including the defendant, were on top of the victim, restraining him on the ground. No other alternative means were taken in that 30-second window, which is the entire incident, ladies and gentlemen. From the minute that Mr. Barretto is taken down to the ground to when that taser is deployed and a fire explosion occurs is 30 seconds or less. And in those 30 seconds or less, the defendant chose to deploy his taser, which was a reckless decision and which is why you are here today. And at the end of this case, after you've heard all of the evidence from all of the witnesses, the state is confident that you will return a verdict of guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walker. Mr. Barr, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court, counselors, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. We are here to discuss the events from February 27th, 2022 that did culminate with an encounter at a Wawa gas station, as the state said. However, it did not begin at the Wawa. There was a lot leading up to that. And the state is right. My client and all police officers are supposed to protect and serve. And that is what my client was doing that day. He was protecting the community and the other motorists and the civilians from the dangerous actions of Gene Barretto Baerga. They keep referring to him as the victim, but when you keep an open mind and hear all the evidence in this case, you're gonna realize he was no innocent victim. He was no Boy Scout. What the evidence is going to show is that earlier that day, the deputies were called out to respond to a chaotic scene, that there were motorcyclists and people on four-wheelers all converging on one area in Osceola County where they were just taking it over. They were mobbing it. They're doing wheelies up and down the road. They're running through red lights. They're going over intersections, over sidewalks. They're putting all the other motorists at danger. And then one of them hold a firearm, not just on one vehicle, but 2. And in one vehicle, there were multiple people in it, a man and his husband. Both of those individuals, as they should, reported that crime to the police, the Osceola County Sheriff's deputies, Osceola County Sheriff's Office. They all respond. Lots of deputies are coming on scene responding to this violent crime, aggravated assault with a firearm. You're going to hear that it wasn't just deputies on the ground. They also even called out the sheriff's office helicopter to the scene. You're going to hear that there was a description given of the suspect who pulled a gun on those innocent motorists who were doing nothing more than just trying to drive down the roadways. You are going to hear that other deputies, including Deputy Kafinas and the helicopter unit, identified the suspect. They found somebody in that area, that in the exact area, just a couple minutes down the road, but several minutes later, that matched the description. They have their suspect. That is how police do their work. People call in crimes, they report it to the police, they give descriptions, and the police go and look for the criminal suspect who matches the description. That is police work 101. That is what happened here. You're going to hear that the first officer in a patrol vehicle to come across that suspect was Deputy Christopher Kofinas. And you're going to hear that he tried initiating a traffic stop on that victim, Jean Barreto Baerga. And you're going to hear that he didn't stop. He didn't pull over. What did he do? He fled from the police. And he didn't just refuse to pull over and continue down the street at a normal pace. No, he fled at high speeds in reckless and dangerous manner. He was driving on sidewalks. You're even going to see video evidence of him doing a wheelie as he's running away from the police. That's how much regard he has for law enforcement. He's doing a wheelie and taunting them as he's escaping from justice, escaping from their efforts to pull him over. And he doesn't just flee and go home. No, he's having too much fun. You're going to hear how he continues for approximately 20 minutes driving all around the area on his motorcycle like a madman, popping wheelies, running through red lights where other cars have to slam on the brakes to avoid collisions, going through medians, up on sidewalks. Every time a cop gets near, whipping a Yui, taking off the other direction, putting all those innocent motorists at risk. But most of this case is going to be focused on what happened at the Wawa. That's where the state's going to try to get you hyper-focused. What happened at the Wawa? And they're going to try to get you to forget about everything that led up to it. But I'm going to ask you to remember all of it and keep an open mind and look at this case as a whole. Now, the state had stated that earlier in the day, Mr. Barreto Baerga had fled from the police. The evidence is going to show it wasn't just earlier in the day, it was immediately preceding the events at the Wawa. In fact, that's where his flight from the police ended. He was fleeing from the police continuously all the way up into the point where he is at the Wawa and the deputies, including my client, make contact with him. Now, the evidence is going to show that when he arrived at the Wawa, he went to a gas pump. He didn't pump gas there. He sat on his bike a while, under the awning, the big overhang. Now the state is going to try to present evidence and convince you that he was just there as a routine matter to fill up his bike with fuel. You're going to hear some conflicting evidence. You're going to see exactly how long he was at the Wawa. You're going to see him at one pump talking with some people. You're going to see him move to a whole nother pump. At some point, he does put the pump in his bike. But what you're going to hear is that the entire transaction, despite all the time he had there, was $1.98, less than a half a gallon of gas. You're going to hear that he wasn't there to refuel his bike. He was trying to hide from the police helicopter under the overhang of the Wawa. Why? Because he was fleeing from the police and had been for 20 minutes leading up to that. That's why he stopped where he did, because he knew there was a helicopter above him. How does he know there's a helicopter above him? How are you going to know that? Because you're going to see video evidence that he actually turns around, looks up at the helicopter and gives him the bird, flicks him off. Once again, that is what he thinks about law enforcement. And it also proves to you that he knew the helicopter was following him. And that's why he went to the Wawa, not to refuel. If he wanted to refuel, he had more than enough time to fill up his tank. And if his tank only needed a half a gallon of gas, then why was he refueling anyways? Now, once we get to the Wawa, there is going to be a very short amount of time that is going to encompass the vast majority of the evidence you're going to hear and the testimony you're going to hear throughout this trial. The state says about 30 seconds. I think it's even less. Everything moves very quickly. Now, my client is the first one there. You're going to see video evidence that when he arrived, he was behind and to the left of the criminal suspect that they were looking for. So when he's looking at him, he's looking at his back. You're going to hear that the gas tank is in front of the motorcycle. You're going to hear how my client couldn't necessarily even see that the nozzle was in there. You're also going to hear and see with your own eyes on video that the angle of the sun is right in his eyes. Now you're going to hear from multiple deputies who are all going to state that they feared that he was going to flee again. That they were all rushing to get to that Wawa as quickly as they can because they needed to stop this man that was putting so many innocent lives in danger. Not just because of the firearm, but with all the fleeing from the police. Now, when my client gets there, he was the first on the scene. He had to make a decision. What did he do? He followed his training. He did run up and grab him from behind because, as you're going to hear, him and all the other deputies received a radio report that he was the suspect who had pulled a firearm on multiple civilian motorists. You're going to hear that according to their training, their law enforcement officer training that they receive in the academy and at their agencies, when you hear a report like that, you are to believe they have that firearm and act accordingly. That is an assumption they have to make according to their training to keep them safe and to keep the civilian population safe. When he went and grabbed him from behind, you're going to hear that was in line with his training. He took him to the ground. Happens all the time, every day in this country. That is a valid law enforcement technique to detain somebody who you believe is violent and fleeing from the police. You're going to hear that when he took him down, the bike was accidentally knocked over. It was just a collateral consequence. The bike's knocked over, and you are going to hear that the gas cap wasn't on. So gasoline started to spill out. No one's going to dispute that. The state said there's virtually a puddle of gasoline. We're in agreement. There was a puddle of gasoline. You're going to see it. You're going to hear it. There's no dispute over that. But what you are going to hear is that after my client took him to the ground and is trying to secure this criminal suspect in handcuffs, he is not complying. He is resisting his efforts. He's fighting against them. He is keeping his hands underneath his body, near his waistline, and no matter how hard he pulls on his hands and says, "Give me your hands," he will not release them. He will not comply with their efforts to arrest him. He's resisting every step of the way. You're going to hear that within seconds of my client getting him to the ground, seconds, Deputy Christopher Kafinas, the same deputy who had tried to pull him over and that the suspect fled from, was the next one on the scene. When he arrived, my client's on the ground with the suspect, and they are both in that puddle of gasoline. What does Deputy Christopher Kafinas do? He immediately draws his taser, and boom, and deploys it against this suspect, striking him in the back with the two prongs and shocking him, electrocuting him, what tasers do. You're going to see that he did that immediately, that he didn't try anything else before he did that. He just drew his taser and shot. You're also going to hear that Deputy Christopher Kafinas used to be a taser instructor in another jurisdiction, somebody who knows how tasers are supposed to be used, somebody who knows where they're not supposed to be used, maybe around gasoline. You're then going to hear that my client because he is grappling and still trying to get the hands and the handcuffs from this resisting suspect, was also electrocuted from the taser, because that's how electricity works. The currents run from one person into the other. He is sharing in that risk that that criminal suspect is in. He is sharing the danger. He is feeling the same electrical charge, and he's in the same puddle of gasoline. Then, when Deputy Kafinas sees that the suspect is still resisting, he still will not give up his hands, Deputy Crawford still cannot give him the handcuffs, he immediately deploys his taser a second time through what you're going to hear is called a drive stun technique, where instead of shooting it at him, you actually drive the prongs of the taser as it's in your hand into a suspect to shock him again. By the grace of God, neither one of Deputy Kafinas's reckless discharges of his taser caused an explosion. You're also going to hear that right after Deputy Kafinas got there, Deputy McLean got there as well, and Deputy De Jesus, who you just heard a little bit about. Deputy McLean, seeing that my client cannot get this man in handcuffs because he's refusing to give up his hands, he's resisting arrest, he goes hands-on as well. Deputy Kafinas, once he realized the taser did not get him compliance that he wanted, he also goes hands-on. Meaning now they're all trying to pull this guy's arms out from underneath him to get him in handcuffs, and he will not remove them from his waistline. 3 deputies struggling with this man still cannot get him to remove his arms. You're going to hear that law enforcement officers receive training and that they have experience in their field. Some of their training is called field training, where you actually learn out in the field. And what's one of the things law enforcement officers learn? That very commonly criminals carry firearms in their waistband. And that's not something new, I'm sure, to any of you. Everyone has seen it in movies and TV shows. People stick guns in waistbands all the time. You're going to hear that based on the report they got, that this man had pulled a firearm or multiple motorists, coupled with the fact that he fled from them and now he's resisting arrest and they cannot get his hands off from his waistband, that these deputies reasonably feared that he had a firearm. And they needed to secure him in handcuffs. That is their job. But they couldn't because he kept resisting. You're going to hear that as they're all going hands-on, at some point, Deputy Kafinas just loses control of his taser. Nobody's quite sure how. Nobody knows if he sets it down on the ground or if he drops it. No one can say for sure. But Deputy Kafinas, who's already discharged his taser twice around the gasoline at the gas pump, against his training, has now lost control of his weapon. And you're going to see with your own eyes, the video evidence and screenshots from where we stopped the video, how that taser landed right next to the suspect. When I say next to him, I mean you're not going to be able to see a gap between the taser and his arm. It is touching him, his right arm. The arm that my client and none of the other deputies have been able to secure. An arm that poses a risk to them, because at the end of that arm is a hand that can grab things, that can grab a taser and use it against them. 3 strikes against Deputy Kafinas. He's now discharged his taser the first time, the second time, and now he's set it down next to a resisting suspect that they accuse of violent crimes and fleeing from the police. Now you're going to see things are moving very, very quickly. They're loud, they're chaotic, there's multiple people yelling different things, and you're going to see that my client, Deputy Crawford, he had no time to think. He had to react. He had to rely on his training. And what his training told him was that you cannot allow a criminal suspect accused of violent crimes who fled from the police to potentially arm themselves with a law enforcement officer.
You may. ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I would just like to remind you that what the lawyers say is not evidence, and you should not consider it as such. It is what they expect the evidence to show, and that you should disregard at this time any reference to the victim being a violent criminal. You may proceed, Mr. Barber.
Thank you. So you're going to hear that what their training tells them to do. Sorry, one moment. Now I lost my train of thought. So what their training tells them to do, all these law enforcement officers, is that if there's a criminal suspect accused of committing a crime involving a firearm and then fleeing from police, they have to proceed under the assumption that person is in fact armed with a firearm. That is what their training tells them to do. Now, getting back to the Wawa, you're going to hear that they're struggling with this person, that he's refusing to give his hands to be handcuffed, and that they cannot gain compliance, even with 3 deputies trying to pull his arms out. You're going to hear how they use alternative means to try to gain compliance. More deputies, maybe one deputy on one arm. You're going to hear how another deputy took another arm, thinking, well, maybe we get more leverage. You're also going to hear how they use the threats of additional force, something they're taught to do in the police academy to try to gain compliance. If you don't stop resisting, you're going to get tased again. You're going to hear that that was said. You're also going to hear that that is a technique that they are taught, that it's not necessarily a statement of their intent. That police officers all the time make verbal threats of force in order to gain compliance. You're going to hear how none of that worked, and they were still struggling with them. And at that moment, I mean, we're down to milliseconds now. Things are moving so quick, and you're going to see when you watch these videos, Deputy Crawford struggling with this man on the ground, he's resisting arrest. He sees the taser there, right next to his arm, his right arm, where he can easily grab it and use it against him or the other deputies, or ignite the gasoline. You're going to hear that Deputy Crawford, as the state said, he was aware the gasoline was there. He's very much aware of the danger of it. He's the one who warned everyone else, hey, watch out, there's gasoline. He knows. And that's why he was afraid. And that's why he cannot, one of the reasons why he can't allow that taser to just sit there in the gasoline. It is an unaccounted for weapon that nobody has control over. It's up for grabs. And who could grab it? Rachel Bayerga can grab it. So what does he do? He does what he's trained to do, to remove it from the situation. You're going to hear that it was on Deputy Crawford's right side, that he's left-handed. You're also going to see a lot of this from multiple different angles of different videos. He picks up the taser. And you're going to see this slowed down on slow-mo speed so you can really see what happens, because the whole thing happens in a second or two. You're going to see when he picks it up, keeps it pointed straight ahead. Not down where the suspect's at. Straight ahead. You're going to see that he moves it from his right hand into his left hand. His throwing hand. Because what hand do we throw with? Whatever hand we're dominant with. That's human nature. He transfers it, continues to keep it pointed straight ahead. So we're talking 90 degrees away from the suspect. You're going to see this from his body camera. You're going to see a first-person point of view looking out what he did. Picks it up, keeps it pointed away from the suspect, transfers hands, goes over to the side because he's going to throw it away. And then it goes off camera, and that's at that point, video evidence doesn't show what's happening in Taser, but you're going to see that up until the entire time it's on frame, it's pointed straight ahead, and he's going off to the left. He's not going down where the suspect is. He's going off to the left to throw it away from the suspect. You're going to see there's a car there. If he throws it under the car, it's away from the reach of the suspect. You're going to see that right about that time, the fire ignites. It's a fireball. There's no other way to describe it. Multiple people are on fire and chaos ensues. Everyone's running every which way, trying to put out the various fires. There's going to be a lot of evidence you're not going to hear. So for instance, the state experts, you're going to hear from state expert witnesses. We anticipate that these expert witnesses are going to try to convince you that my client intentionally discharged a taser. However, we're confident that once you really listen to all the facts and all the evidence, that you're going to realize that that didn't happen. You're also going to hear from every state expert, they can't really say whether anything was done intentionally or on accident. The state told you that they were going to have an expert, Brian Childs from Axon, state that there's no way a taser could go off accidentally. We're positing that you are absolutely going to hear that a taser can go off accidentally from multiple people, including their own experts. You're going to hear that in struggles, sometimes weapons go off accidentally. You're also going to hear from a state arson investigator. He's a detective that works for the state of Florida who investigates fires. You're going to hear him state that he came up with 4 reasonable hypotheses for how that fire started. And the taser going off is just one of them. Why? Because he can't say for sure. Nobody can. There's not one witness who's going to be able to say for sure that that taser is what discharged, that discharge of that taser is what caused that fire. No one can say that. He's going to say, well, yeah, my report came up with 4 reasonable hypotheses. That was just one of them. That's one I believe, but there's 4. You're also going to hear on cross-examination him admit to multiple other ones. You're going to hear him say that, yeah, you know, that engine on that bike was really, really hot. It was laying in that gasoline. That can start a fire. You're also going to hear, yeah, it could have been an electrical failure that started the fire. Also could have been the hot engine from the car parked next to it that started the fire. You're going to hear him say those are all in his report. You're also going to hear him admit during cross-examination there were even more reasonable hypotheses, not including his report, that he's going to admit, yeah, those are reasonable hypotheses for how the fire could have started too. He's going to talk to you about static electricity discharges and how those can and will start fires. You're going to hear that one of the deputies, I believe it's Deputy DeJesus, when he saw the bike on the ground spilling gasoline out, he decided, I need to pull that bike up to stop the gasoline coming out. Reasonable thought to have. You're going to hear that at the second he grabbed that bike and moved it was the same exact moment the fire started. And you're going to hear that metal scraping across pavement can also start fires, and is another reasonable hypothesis for how the fire could have started. So you're not going to hear the fire investigator say, oh, I could definitely say 100% confidence, that the taser started the fire. You're going to hear him say there were other reasonable hypotheses. Then he might try to dance around a little bit, convince you there's no other way, but you're going to hear all the other ways that fire could have started. And you're going to hear from that engineer from Axon. Axon is the company that makes tasers. You're going to hear that. You're going to hear some very interesting things about him, or from him. So the state's going to try to convince you that there was nothing wrong with this taser. Perfectly fine working condition. Except you're going to hear the engineer from the company who made that taser admit, okay, not really. In fact, there was an anomaly. Not just any anomaly, a unique anomaly no one has ever seen before and cannot reproduce. You're going to hear that taser sometimes produces results in its data for events that didn't really occur, trigger pulls that didn't really occur. Now, of course, Axon, they manufacture this taser, so they're going to try to convince you, oh, it wasn't our product. I mean, yeah, we found the anomaly, but no, it must have been human error. They're also going to try to convince you, yeah, these don't go off by themselves, except you're going to hear from many, many witnesses that does happen. You're also going to hear him refer to it as a bug in the software of this taser. So when the state's trying to convince you that there was nothing wrong with this taser, you're going to hear evidence that's going to convince you otherwise. And you're going to be convinced that you cannot rely upon the data from that taser because of these anomalies that nobody can really reproduce, no one's ever seen. Why? Because it's a defective taser. Something wrong with it. You're also going to hear that he performed a visual inspection of the taser. He physically looked at it. And this is very important. You're going to hear on the outside, there's nothing wrong with it, meaning no damage. You're going to hear there was no burn marks, no melted plastic, no charring. Taser looks fine. You're going to get to see those photos for yourself. Why is that important? Because the state is trying to convince you that my client took a taser in his hand, went down to the suspect, and pulled the trigger to intentionally tase him. And then that's when the fire started. That was true. The evidence is going to show you that that taser would have been damaged. How do we know that? Because you're going to see there were other items containing plastic in the fire all over the bike. You're going to hear about how the bike had a seat made of plastic, handlebars, even a little cap that goes around the gas tank, all made of plastic, that they were all melted and burned. Taser wasn't. You're going to hear evidence that that's because the taser wasn't in the fire. Why? Because it was thrown off to the side. It wasn't intentionally discharged on the subject below, rather, it's over there. You are also going to hear, or we anticipate you're going to hear from a state's use of force expert. He's going to try to go through and analyze every action that my client did, and he's going to analyze it against what's called generally accepted practices and principles and policies and laws, and he's going to try to get you to hyper-focus on just a few of the facts while ignoring all the others. But if you pay close attention on cross-examination, that expert is going to make a lot of admissions. And when pressed, he's going to admit that the actions my client took were reasonable within the generally accepted principles and practices, and that it was in conformity with his training. The state wants you to just focus on a couple facts. They're going to try to establish that my client was the one that yelled out, "You're going to get tased again," and that is a statement of his intent, while getting you to ignore the fact that they are trained to do that, and that is a valid technique for gang compliance. You threaten the use of force even when you're not going to use it because they don't know that. It's called a bluff. They're allowed to do that. In this case, another big fact that the state is going to try to get you hyper-focused on is, never mind. So in this case, what I want you to do is not hyper-focus on any one fact, but look at the big picture, totality of the circumstances. The state's going to try to keep you from seeing the forest from the trees, but we want you to be able to see the whole picture. The facts are going to show that my client, Deputy David Crawford, was a good deputy who followed his training. He responded to a chaotic situation that included a suspect that was refusing to comply with commands, refusing to be arrested, by fleeing from police, by not giving up his hands, and that he had to take action. Not sit there and think about, let's sit here and weigh everything in an academic setting. No, he's in the field. He has to take actions. He doesn't have time to think. You're going to hear that officers are trained that when you're in those fast-moving situations, you rely on your training. That's why you practice the same thing over and over and over and over, so that they don't have to think when they're in the field. They just act. And as long as they act in accordance with their training, they're supposed to be okay. You're going to hear that he, my client, is the only one charged with a crime related to this. You're going to hear that Deputy Christopher Kofinas.
Objection. Relevance.
Sustained.
Now, the state is also going to try to get you to focus a lot on the injuries of the suspect, Gian Barreto Baerga. I'm going to ask you to decide this case without any sympathy. I can't ask you to check your emotions at the door. You're human. You're allowed to have emotions, but they cannot be used when deciding this case. You cannot return a verdict because you feel bad for someone or because they got hurt. So I'm going to ask you to stay focused on the evidence and the law. Now, there are certain things you're not going to hear. You're going to sit here for days viewing, listening to evidence. You're not going to hear anyone get up there and say, oh, I saw Deputy Crawford intentionally tase the suspect.
Objection argumentative.
Judge, may we approach? We're going to ask that you carefully and objectively analyze this case based on nothing else but the evidence, what it does show, what it doesn't show, and the law as you are instructed by the judge. And at the close of all of that, we are going to ask you to return a verdict, the only verdict supported by the law and the facts, which is that my client is not guilty of these charges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. The state may call its first witness. You may.
Will we do that?